Happy Easter, good afternoon, and welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Hammond, and joining me as co-host is Zahi Nina. Welcome.
Hi.
Now, we have the largest election in history coming up in a month's time. Joining us to talk about it and to talk about pre-election polls and what they get right and what they get wrong is Dr. Kevin Bonham, a polling analyst. Kevin, welcome.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
It's good to see you. During the show, you can post your comments in the comments section, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So, firstly, Kevin, tell us what an election analyst does in contrast with general pollsters.
So pollsters have a much narrower range of tasks than me. A pollster is basically trying to work out what people think at the time a poll is taken, who they might be voting for, what they think of the leaders, what they think of the issues. I look at all aspects of elections, not just polling, but also past election results, what we can say about things like how people's preferences flow, what we can say about the accuracy of polling, what we can say about if a poll is correct, what will be the likely result based on it. The pollsters don't have to project results off their polls. They're just saying these are the raw votes, and people like me can do what we like with them.
So, what makes some polls like Newspoll and Ray Morgan more useful than others?
I'd say that Newspoll is the most useful of the federal voting intention polls because it has a long history. It goes back to the mid-80s. It has always asked the questions in a stable form, although the people operating the polling have changed over time, and the way the polls are conducted has changed over time. But it's exactly the same questions that have gone back since the mid-1980s, and also it doesn't have a record of breaking to one side particularly more than the other at elections. So on average, it has been fairly accurate, fairly close, and not noticeably skewed. Also, now that the Australian Polling Council is formed, we can see a lot more of how Newspoll operates because YouGov is one of the transparent pollsters that has started revealing more information about itself. Morgan, I would say, in my view, is one of the least useful polls because for many of those statements that I've made, the opposite applies. Morgan is not transparent, and Morgan has a history of skewing to Labor at elections. Not all elections, but quite often it has wrongly predicted Labor victories that have not occurred.
So, do you think the undecided voters, in fact, indecisive about their choices?
I should say that at the moment there's a couple of different concepts swirling around. There's been a lot of talk about uncommitted voters. Uncommitted voters and undecided voters are not the same. An uncommitted voter may have a pretty firm idea of who they are likely to vote for, but they're just saying, I'm not quite sure yet. Undecided voters are the ones who you ask them who they're voting for, they say they don't know. You quite often, for most pollsters, you ask them who they're voting for again, you say, who are you leaning to? And they don't even say the second time around, they're not even sure who they're leaning to. That can be voters who have no idea who they're going to vote for, possibly because they're not following politics closely. But it might also be voters who are tossing up between a couple of parties and really haven't made up their mind. Something I'd like to see more is polling that asks, who are you considering? You know, are you undecided between Labor and the Greens? Because a person who's undecided between Labor and the Greens is probably going to preference Labor even if they don't vote for them. Or are you undecided between the two major parties? Because those voters have a much bigger impact.
We talked about the Newspoll. You answered a question about Newspoll. Newspoll is published by The Australian and is one of the most talked about. Given that News Corp is quite controversial in some political circles, how does Newspoll avoid preconceived biases, you think?
So Newspoll does get a lot of conspiracy theories from its association with News Corp. At the moment, Newspoll is conducted by YouGov, and the polling is contracted out to them. So it's not News Corp actually doing the polling itself. It's an independent pollster. But even when it was a News Corp linked company, there still wasn't a problem with bias. And I think this is because the pollster doesn't have any anything to gain from being skewed, and the newspaper doesn't have anything to gain from its poll being skewed. Because if the poll does skew to one side or another at elections and get elections wrong a lot of the time because of that, then people won't take it seriously. So they want to be able to say, "Hey, our poll's accurate, and our poll is good, and this is really what it's like." The other thing there is that even if polls set out to influence elections, there's no evidence that they can actually do so. There's no evidence that people change their views in the vast majority of seats based on what the polling says. There's no evidence that showing a side ahead makes that side more likely to win. If anything, the opposite.
Just asking a question based on the thoughts of undecided voters. You mentioned that you wish that questions would be asked about who they were considering to vote for. Why is it that those questions aren't being asked?
Oh, there's only so many. I think there's only so many questions that a pollster wants to include in their repertoire, and that's sort of the number of undecided voters is not that high. It's about 7% in current polls. Some of them down as low as 5%, but it does become relevant when you do something like pick 100 undecided voters to go and be an audience for a debate between Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. You'd want to know whether they were really tossing up between the two major parties or whether they were sort of people who were fairly committed to the left or the right. I think that often those sort of undecided panel polls for debates are a bit problematic.
Our last guest, Judith Brett, said that what shocked everyone at the last election when the Liberal Party won was that the exit polls presumed the ALP would be winning. Why did pollsters have that initial impression?
We don't know too much about the exit poll. There was only one exit poll that I know of conducted on the day, and it was a sample of certain marginal seats, and we don't know a lot about its methods. We do know a lot about the lead-up polls, which uniformly said that Labor was narrowly winning, and Australian polling had been so accurate in federal elections for so long that we were used to just taking it as, oh, that's what's going to happen. It might be 1% out or something like that, but it's not going to be. We're not used to it being 3% out. We've been actually spoiled in comparison with the rest of the world, where errors that would amount to 2.5% on a two-party basis are the norm.
So just dragging it down from the previous question of the news poll, what errors do you think these polls usually have when conducting the polls among general public?
So a lot has changed since that election. For the 2019 election, there's been quite a lot of investigation of what went wrong. Why were the polls wrong at the 2019 election? The major suspects are that the polls did not reweight respondents enough for useful information about respondents, that they may have been over capturing people who were very educated, very involved in politics, very interested in politics, which is easy to fix. You can sort of get indicators of that and reweight your sample or target respondents differently. But also that they may have been under capturing voters who were very disengaged, and that voters who are very disengaged may have broken very strongly to the coalition at that election.
Has there been any introspection following that event?
Yes, there's been there've been reviews. There've been some pollsters, particularly YouGov, that have put a lot of work into trying to overhaul their methods, coming up with new methods, coming up with more complex ways of controlling for the problems that happened in 2019. It varies by pollster. There's been an Australian Polling Council formed, which means that a lot of the polls are now more transparent, and you find out a lot more about how they operate and what questions they ask, what weightings they use, what their effective sample size is, these sorts of things. But it varies in terms of which pollsters have done anything about it. In the case of Roy Morgan, they haven't joined the Polling Council, and we can't see that they've become more transparent, so we're not sure what they've changed, apart from that they dropped face-to-face polling because of the pandemic. In the case of the new pollster Resolve Political Monitor, They haven't joined the polling council either. They've released a fair amount of detail about their methods, but there's still a lot of things we don't know about how they operate. So it's a mixed response across the polling industry. And it will be interesting to see at this election whether the pollsters who have made obvious changes do better than the ones who have not.
What do you think? Who usually get polled, and what impressions do they give to questioners who ask those questions?
These days, most Australian polling is conducted by online panel polling. A pollster has access to a huge number of email addresses. They might have a panel of 100,000 respondents or something like that. They get these from various marketing lists or possibly by opt-ins on their websites. And they each time they do a poll, they will target a certain number of these. They will identify ones to target to try to get a balanced sample from the start so that they're not too reliant on waiting. They send out email invitations to join in the survey, and the person who does the survey, they'll often be doing lots of other surveys. They won't be just doing polling. They'll be doing heaps of market research thing with just the occasional poll. And they do the survey and they get a reward in points, which they can then use towards shopping vouchers or money or something like that. And it's not a very big reward. It's not something that anybody's going to get rich on, but it's just a nice little side earner.
Hmm.
A few pollsters still use telephone polling. There's some telephone polling mixed into some of the national polls. It's more commonly used in seat polling. So for seat polling, you get a lot of robo polls where you get an automated voice and you press buttons and so on. But that's basically on the way out for national polling. And the sort of the stereotype you hear about pollsters only calling landlines, that's completely stopped. Nobody's been only calling landlines for several years now.
Oh wow, there you go. About the transparency, where do the polls? So you mentioned that they make them more transparent. Do they put them up on their website, their methods, if they release them?
The pollsters who are Australian Polling Council members are required to release methods details within 2 business days of any part of a poll's findings becoming public, with certain limited exceptions. So when a news poll goes up, within 2 days, YouGov will be putting up an item on its website, and it has a special Australian Polling Council section. Most of the pollsters have separate Australian Polling Council sections where they put up these methods details, and you can go and look at them, and you can go and see how the poll was conducted. You can't see everything. There are some details that they do not disclose, but you can see much more than you used to be able to see.
Scott Morrison's ahead of Anthony Albanese, but Labor is being predicted to win. Do we have this presumption that it could be a hung parliament, or that Labor could win a minority government?
I think this is a very fluid current situation because we had Labor with a very large lead that has also rapidly contracted in the last few weeks. And we had a polling failure at the last election. We don't know whether the relationship between polls and results that we've seen in the past still applies. But even in that case, there is a lot that can change during campaigns anyway. So I think there's still a wide range of things that could happen, from anything from a Labor landslide through to a coalition increased majority. All those things are still on the table and possible. If you believe the past relationship between polls and results, then the median outcome is a sort of small Labor majority. But I don't take it for granted that relationship necessarily holds true. Pollsters could still be having the same problems they had last time. Pollsters could be overcompensating for the problems they had last time. It will be very interesting to see what occurs. I should say, on the matter of Morrison leading Albanese, now most of this comes from the preferred or better Prime Minister polling. Preferred or better Prime Minister polling is a bit of a bugbear of polls, in my opinion. It has a history of skewing to the incumbent Prime Minister, where you see Newspoll if Newspoll has the 2 parties at 50-50, then on average the incumbent Prime Minister will be 15 points ahead as preferred Prime Minister. So it's a very misleading indicator. I pay more attention to the net satisfactions of the leaders. And so recently there we've seen that Albanese moved in front of Morrison for a while, but now that is switching back, at least in the latest news poll and also the latest resolve, that that Morrison is now having the better personal ratings, not by much.
We see that the minor parties, aside from the Greens, are getting 12% of the vote. The Climate 200 independents are also earning the amount of sway as well. How much would they need to achieve to win at least one seat?
It's basically impossible to project seats for minor parties off the national polling reliably. It works best for predicting who is going to win the two-party seats between Labor and Liberal, whether Labor, how many two-party seats Labor will beat the Liberals in, and vice versa. The support for independents and Greens tends to be very concentrated in certain seats, and it's very hard to say from the national polling whether an independent is going to pick up enough to win a seat, whether an independent is going to get what they need, which might only be a 30% primary vote in a given seat. As the Green primary goes up, or as the independent primary goes up, then the chance that they'll get a seat somewhere probably increases. But it's actually been very difficult to get a read on what independents are polling at this election. There is a very wide range of difference between different pollsters in terms of what they say independents are getting, or what you might infer independents are getting from where they put the others vote at. And there are a lot of seat polls, but they're generally unreliable. They're often conducted by biased sources, and it's hard to get a read from those as well of how these independent candidates are going.
What about Zali Steggall at the last election?
So at the last election, Steggall's victory was reasonably well predicted by polling. There were a few polls that showed her to be on track to win big, and that were broadly accurate. And these included some of the commission polls by GetUp and so on. Whether they were accurate at the time they were taken is another question. They may have been overestimating her vote at the time they were taken, and then there was a big snowball to her as the election got closer. That can happen a lot with independents. It gets to be a sort of a point where Labor and Green voters realise that there's a strong independent running. They realise that there's a tactical voting thing where it makes more sense to vote for the independent than it does to vote for their own parties, and they all pile in, and the independent gets a huge primary vote.
When the issues being polled are controversial, so usually social issues, how reliable are the answers?
This has been a trouble in the past when pollsters were doing more live polling. Live phone polling, particularly face-to-face polling where you go and knock on someone's door, which Morgan used to do a lot of, that carries a social desirability risk. That carries a risk that people are just saying what they think they want the interviewer to hear. And as a result, things like the same-sex marriage postal survey polling, pollsters got the right winner, but they overestimated the margin by, on average, quite a lot. I think I got it on average at about 8 points, and that's the same as has been found in the US for similar measures. That the people are more conservative than they indicate in those sorts of face-to-face polls, or those sorts of polls where you're talking to a live person. But these days, most polling is not like that. So these days, there's actually no reason to fib to a pollster. There's no, if you're just filling in a survey for rewards on the computer, no one's checking that it's you. No one's going to hold it against you if you say something politically incorrect. So nowadays, those sorts of issue polls are just down to whether you've got a representative sample or not.
In 2016, you had Brexit, and you had Donald Trump's 2016 election victory. It was predicted that neither of these would happen. no, sorry, the exit polls showed that it would happen. Why do people presume that it wouldn't happen?
Well, exit polls are only taken on the day, so so people haven't had a lot of time to build up expectations before an exit poll is taken. It's the lead up polling pointed to different results in the case of Brexit. In the case of Trump in 2016, that's more complicated. The public nationwide polling for Trump in 2016 was fine. It predicted that Hillary Clinton will win the popular vote by a narrow margin. That happened. The problem with the US in 2016 was in about 4 key states where the polling was rubbish. And in some of those cases, the polling was rubbish because pollsters didn't think the contest was competitive and there weren't a lot of polls being taken close to the date. But it was also problems with polling methods in those particular states. And those problems actually, a lot of those problems actually got worse in 2020. The national, the state polling in 2020 and the national polling in 2020 were actually worse than 2016. It's just lucky that they were predicting Biden to have a comfortable victory. Biden actually had an extremely narrow victory when you look at it on a state by state basis.
Why do they think that the election results wouldn't be competitive?
It's like if you're polling for a state shows that Hillary Clinton is 10 points ahead, then it's like the media is not interested in commissioning any more polls for that state because they think it's in the bag, and there are, you go and poll in another state that looks closer instead. So some of these races were just not considered to be of that much interest. They were considered to be almost certain Clinton victories, and then on the day Trump won.
Do you think there's any do you think there's ever been any closer analysis of times when the media have said a certain candidate has won, and then it's turned out to not be the case at all? Like, we've had quite a number of them, in the UK, in the US, and in Australia. Has anyone properly looked into this?
We had a string of them where the problem is media overconfidence. The media sort of see that someone is slightly ahead and declare that side is almost certain to win, which historically is not the case. Historically, when the average of polls is close, there is a reasonable chance that the opposite result will occur. Some analysts also presented models that were overconfident. You had some supposedly serious analysts in the United States who were presenting ridiculous models that said that Clinton was a 90% chance or even a 99% chance, which was just simply not a reasonable reading of the data. It has led to a perception of polling skewing to the left and consistently underestimating the right, but that's not true. There are lots of cases that have gone the other way. A huge one was New Zealand. In New Zealand, the polls were massively wrong in terms of how much they underestimated how much Jacinda Ardern was going to win the last election by. They were terrible. They were much worse than Australia's. And there's been a number of other cases like that. There isn't a systematic thing of them missing to the right or missing to the left, but when they miss to the right, people take it as confirming this theory that they always miss to the right, and so you get some people who sort of see those few leading examples and believe it's always like that, and it's not.
Kind of like I think the Eden Monaro by-election. I believe Sky News called it early and said that the Liberals had won.
I didn't actually see that.
Okay.
Yeah, it was never. It was sort of like Labor was always better placed when I was watching the live count. But also, I mean, once you get numbers starting to come in on election night, that is a different thing. You're reading live numbers. You're not reading polling. You're extrapolating from booths and so on.
Do you believe the shy Tory effect, or perhaps a quiet Australian effect, exists that would make polls unreliable? Or has that changed because we're no longer doing face-to-face polling?
Yeah, shy Tory effect is one of the things that's been talked about many times when there's been polling failures in the direction of the left over the years. And almost always when there's a thorough investigation conducted after the election, it turns out that that's not the problem. And in Australia particularly, there's not